Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
You should see my screen. Okay. 1 second, sorry. Okay. Welcome to this international Ferpi Talk. Today we have two guests from America, from the United States, Nolan and Mikey. Probably Mikey has some problem to connect, but Nolan is already online. Welcome, Nolan.
Thank you.
I was supposed to be with Marco Dotti, a journalist from Vita magazine, an Italian magazine dedicated to the NGO sectors, but he has some health problems, and today he is not able to connect, but he will be with us in the next meeting and next webinar of International Ferpi Talks. As you know, is a series of webinar that we started in 2019 with experts of communication, public relations, and community builders from all around the world. This second wave of appointment will be dedicated to critical thinking, and we're starting with Nolan, because Nolan and Mikey have written this book, United States of Destruction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America, and what we can do about it. A book that I have read last weeks, and then I have contacted Nolan and Mikey to have a conversation with us. Nolan Higdon is an author and lecturer of history and media studies at California State University, East Bay. Higdon sits on the boards of the Action Coalition for Media Education and Northwest Alliance for Alternative Media and Education. His most recent publication is United States of Destruction, as I was saying, with Mikey Huff. He is co-host of the Along the Line podcast and long-time contributor to Project Censored annual book, Censored. In addition, he has been a guest commentator for the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and numerous television news outlets. Welcome, Nolan.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. This is awesome.
Thank you. If Mikey is connecting, I will call him on stage. But now we start with you. So in your book, you talk about Trump presidency as the temporary phase of an increasingly invasive corporate algorithm, one that views civil liberties, the public interest, the commons, and the democracy-centered institution mandated to serve them as enemy forces to be administratively deconstructed. The algorithm unifies by distraction and extraction. Can you give us a better idea? Can you explain your views on these two concepts of distraction and extraction?
Yeah, we were approached to write this book by City Lights Publishing, and one of our first kind of ideas out of our mind was we don't want to write another book about Trump. We've been studying history of politics and media for quite some time, and we saw Trump largely as a symptom rather than the actual problem. And you have to remember, the time we started writing this book, there were so many questions about, like, how did Donald Trump get elected to the presidency? And one of the things we emphasize in the book is we looked at his media strategy, which which I'll go into in a minute, is really based on distractionary techniques. But the only reason it works is because our media system is so inept at actually serving democracy. Trump, was well aware that our media system is obsessed with spectacle. It's obsessed with partisan arguments. And as a result, he tried to kind of create his candidacy as something that could be a spectacle, that could feed into partisanship, because he rightly knew the media could not stop covering him. And so Trump himself kind of became a distraction from larger issues that were pressing in American society at the time. And as a result, Trump was able to kind of control the narrative on the media trail. In the process, though, it really kind of extracted almost a complacency amongst the electorate, in the sense that you either were sort of with Trump or you were against him. And we got these kind of oversimplified narratives in the United States that if Trump did anything and you were opposed to Trumpism or the Republicans, you had to be against it, even if it was something you previously supported. And vice versa was true for Republicans as well. If you supported Trump, you had to be opposed to anything Democrats did, even if it was things you previously supported. And so it kind of extracted this complacency with the system, and really kind of galvanized and cemented the candidacy of Trump. And that's kind of the story we told in the book, was that Trump walked into a landscape that was fertile for this strategy. He did not necessarily create the landscape, he just exploited it.
Sure. And do you think this partisanship, this kind of landscape is also applicable to other countries, such as, for example, Italy or Europe at large?
So I'm sorry, we asking, do I think if it's applicable?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's every nation has its own obvious unique differences, but there's a lot of scholarly literature coming out right now, and we cover some of this in the book, that the real kind of game changer for global politics, both at the national level and the global level, came in the 1970s. And this is when governments saw their role as overseeing the economy rather than managing it, and they became less concerned with kind of economic equality for all. And what they did was, this is what scholars call neoliberal democracy. They moved away from having the people have direct oversight of the market, because it was believed that the voters would, quote unquote, take more than they deserved, right? This is very elitist argument on its face. So they tried to create institutions like central banks and things that operate outside of democratic control. So in a democracy, you have say over some things, but definitely not the economy. Well, what that kind of left us with was largely divisive cultural issues in a lot of countries. In the United States, these were focused on things like women's right to choose when it came to issues of abortion. It was same-sex marriage, immigration to a degree. These things became like polarizing cultural politics, and our politics focused more and more on those because we had less control of these things that I would argue kind of had more of an impact on citizens' lives, like the economy, for example, or foreign policy and those types of things. So at some level, we're seeing, again, looking at Trump as a symptom and not the cause. If you look globally, Trump is part of this kind of larger rejection of market liberalism as it's been sort of shaped in the last 40 years by various countries. And that's why on the extreme left and extreme right of American politics, right, and extreme by American standards is pretty tepid, but they disagree on tons of cultural issues. I mean, Trump, say, on the right, and Bernie Sanders on the left disagree on a whole litany of cultural issues. But in their rhetoric, at least, maybe not in practice, but in their rhetoric, they both sort of agree that there needs to be more democratic oversight or government involvement with economic issues. And the fact that both of those sides of the spectrum are rejecting the market liberal center, I think you can, and some scholars have done this, you can transpose that in other countries like Italy as well. That there's, this, what one scholar called anti-system politics, and Mark Blythe calls like angrynomics. So these folks are rejecting that status quo. So yeah, I think that our thesis is applicable at some level, but keeping in mind the uniqueness of every country.
Absolutely. Yes, there are also similar mechanisms. For example, the extraction of data that you explain in the book, and the use that has been done during the recent election of not only Trump but also other candidates around the world. That if paired with distraction on main issues, brings to polarization of parties and partisanship, probably. But so, let's go to one of the next point that we were thinking about, and that probably is important also for Italy and for our country. So what you say in the book is that ineffective educational system, the fragmented media landscape, mainly driven by, in US, 6 corporations that owns the 90% of the broadcast, and the post-truth uprising become a dangerous mix that threatens democracy, not only in US. Italy and other European countries are in similar condition, probably. Can you give your thoughts on this situation that sees probably, as you were saying, the government less concerned by inequality, and this brings an ineffective educational system and other things to be the causes of this trend?
Yeah, we had and this again is easily put in a global context. Some at the low end, Americans spend about 11 hours a day consuming media. At the high end, it averages about 16 hours a day consuming media. And that's to say that media is a huge influence in the way people think. It shapes our behaviors and attitudes, and increasingly it plays a larger and larger role in that. But we dropped this media bomb on a generation, but we did not create an educational infrastructure to support it. So, I go back to like the founding fathers in the United States. They were big advocates for the idea that we should have free press because they wanted truth and good ideas to get out there, right? But what they kind of failed to recognize was that just because good ideas or truth is out there doesn't mean people necessarily have the skills to recognize it. And that's where I kind of point to our ineffective education system. We didn't really teach people how to sift through information, to delineate truth from falsehood, and how to recognize sound arguments and spot weak ones, evaluate evidence, these kinds of things. Nor did we and we go into this in the book, teach folks about the political economy of media, that these media corporations, like you noted, the 6 corporations that control 90% of American news media, they don't just own news, they own other industries. Like famously for a long time, General Electric owned NBC, and General Electric was also in the defense industry. So NBC generally touted a pro-war narrative because it made money for General Electric, those kinds of things. So we argue that an effective education system would teach critical thinking, it would teach a critical awareness of media so that users could be equal participants in media rather than just kind of consuming media thoughtlessly. They could be users of media. Where this connects to the fragmented media landscape is that there's still kind of this almost naive techno-utopian narrative around media, that is that it's this great thing and there's tons of information and we all have access and we're equal participants. Where the reality of it is that your online experience is shaped by the company and corporation that controls the platform. They're the ones who are collecting your data. They're the ones that are setting limits. They're the ones who are controlling what you do and don't see. You know, I always like to say that, like, Google is not a search engine company. Facebook is not a social media company. They're all advertising companies. They collect data and they sell it to different companies. And what they've largely found is kind of two things. One is that people will stay on their screen if you scare them. So you sending divisive stories or creating social media as a way to argue and debate will keep people on their screens. And people will also continue to click if they feel reinforced in their views. So if you believe something totally false, right? Like if you believe there was a fake news story that Donald Trump sent a private ship to save Navy SEALs, for example. If you believe that, you know, Google is more likely to send you a link when you search for it that confirms that rather than the litany of websites that debunk it. And this is what we meant by this fragmented media landscape. We're all kind of in our own, what Ellie Prazer calls a filter bubble, where this information reinforces our worldview, outside information doesn't get in. We have the ability to block out things we don't like, not because they're false, because we don't like them. And so it makes it really difficult to communicate. And we don't have kind of an education system that makes people aware of what their online experience actually is. So we advocate that, you know, democracy really kind of hangs on this idea that we have to teach people about the media they're consuming, how to use it responsibly, and to get out of their own filter bubble, to be comfortable being facing information that may counter their worldview, and that it's actually a good thing to change your view. You know, we back in 2004, we had this election here for the presidency where John Kerry was accused of changing his mind on the war, and he was in. They pejoratively called him a flip-flopper. You know, we argue it's good to flip-flop. If you find new evidence that disproves something you previously believed, that's a good thing. And we think that's part of education, is to make people comfortable in the idea that it's okay to change your mind when you're presented with new evidence. You don't have to hold on to your views forever.
So it's a filter bubble that probably during this last 3 months was increased by the way of we have lived with the pandemics. Everyone closed at home, looking into the screen of his computer and sharing with the people that he can find online or for work or for other interests. It's strange. This pandemic brought us in a more controlled world than before. Everything goes to online stores, online connection. We are now connected by a virtual online platform. It's not, I think all these topics are not given for counted. I would like to go to the idea that you propose in the second part of the book. There is the first part that is more critical regarding the American situation. It's an analysis of what's happened and why you are there. We can say that it's more an analysis of what happened. And then in the second part, you call the chapter "Make America Think Again." We can try to switch to "Make Italy Think Again" or "Make Europe Think Again." And you give some proposal. One of these is critical media literacy education. I found this very important concept that we may try to implement also in Italy or in our local communities. Can you give us more ideas of what is critical media literacy education for you, and what can be done?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to make a qualifier, since I'm speaking to folks in Italy, that there's a European version to media literacy and there's an American version. And okay. So in America, we have a distinction between critical media literacy and just media literacy. That's not the same in Europe. So I'm going to talk about it in the American context, but I just want to make that clear, because there's a lot of great folks in Europe who do great work, and it's going to be different than what I'm about to say about my American colleagues. You know, most of American media literacy has been focused on kind of getting people to use tools. So how do we get people to use Microsoft and Sony and Facebook and Nickelodeon? How do we get them on their screens? This is what we kind of call the acritical version of media literacy, and it's largely funded by corporations who want to get more customers, who want to get more data, and they've pretty much dominated the conversation in America about media literacy. There's a smaller group of us who believe in something we call critical media literacy. We come out of kind of a cultural studies framework from the Frankfurt School, and we believe that these tools can be used as a force of resistance and liberation, but we need to explore the power dynamics that are expressed in media. And so that's kind of the framework we come at media literacy with. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, we think this is a studying the power dynamics behind media is important so students are made aware of what is happening in their online experience. That are they being treated like a user, or are they being treated like a consumer, and what do those distinctions mean? What are the messages in media? Who has the power to tell those messages? These are the kind of things that we want students to play with. We don't want to tell students what to think. We want to kind of teach them how to think. What are the skills necessary to think in a media literacy context? And it's largely centered on issues of power. We see media as an expression of power. Media expresses power dynamics. They're in media. So how do we explore that? So we try and teach students to always look at those messages behind media, whether it be social media, whether it be film, whether it be advertisement. We think that's important for the democratic process. There's been so much outrage about fake news, and I just completed a book on the history of fake news here in America. But the discourses on fake news in America largely centered on the Republican Party, Donald Trump, and these kind of vague connections to the Russian government. That was basically the extent of our conversation on fake news. And there's some truth to all those, but fake news is a much larger problem. Political parties engage in fake news, governments including ours, engage in fake news. Independent actors do, news media, supposed journalists engage in fake news. And so if you're going to teach students to be critical of media, they need to be aware that fake news doesn't come from some myopic list of actors. It's actually a much larger problem in the society. And so that's what we hope to teach with critical media literacy, is just to make students aware of the power dynamics in media, and then they can decide for themselves how they want to use the media. But as we vaguely kind of talk about in the book, critical scholars get a lot of pushback in the United States for trying to introduce power dynamics. There's a lot of folks who would prefer we didn't talk about things like race and gender and class and how they are expressed in media. So that's something I think is at least in my experience, true for the American context. I can't say that about Europe, and that's why I made that kind of qualifier at the beginning. But that's kind of what we advocate for in the book. And, I work on a lot of projects. I sit on a lot of boards like ACME, the Global Critical Media Literacy Project. Jeff Scher, who's down at University of California, Los Angeles, I work with him. He's got some great resources. There's the Critical Media Literacy Project in University of Southern California. And then we have a conference in October, which is a conference that's at projectcensored.org, which goes into this as well. So we're with you in this effort that we'd like to see critical media literacy expanded, largely to serve democracy.
Okay, thanks. What is the age that you think students should start to being educated on critical media literacy? Because what I find in my experience at university is that probably at the age of 22, 23, it's not too late. Obviously, it's never too late, but probably it would be useful before.
Yeah, I would concur. I teach at the college level, and most of my work is in teacher preparation. So I try and teach teachers how to teach critical media literacy. But I work with a lot of organizations that start with parents, teaching parents how to teach their children at a young age. And it's funny you bring this up. In my recent book on fake news, I credited my mom. I can remember being a young kid and watching some advertisement, and of course right away I saw the advertisement I wanted, whatever it was, and my mother immediately said, you can't believe those advertisements, they're not all true. And that that blew my mind as a young kid. But I think those kinds of lessons are really important. They stick with you for a very long time. So I would advocate it starts at the youngest age possible. You can start talking about media, because we know almost from the time children are born, you stick, especially now, they stick smartphones in their faces and take pictures of them. So they're being exposed to media almost instantly. So I think it's never too early to start.
Yeah, and probably if when we were younger and we were looking at TV, there was a lot of advertising, obviously, but it was advertising on TV. Now, what the children are living is a world entirely driven by social media, interaction with YouTube, videos that are advertised. They are native in 100% in this kind of work. So probably we should start very early if we want future generation to be more educated on critical media literacy.
Yeah, and there were some there's some studies that some people, not until they're like 6 or 7 years old, can tell the difference between an advertisement and a program or entertainment. So to your point, that this is kind of being consumed almost mindlessly. They don't recognize an advertisement's trying to get them to buy something. They might see it as like an entertainment story.
Yeah. So if we go on with your proposals, after the critical media literacy, there is also the civic engagement, the civics education. You call it the 5 C's, no?
Mm-hmm.
So civics education, critical thinking, critical awareness of media, community engagement, and cultural competency.
Yeah, civic engagement's a big one for us here in the United States, and just I don't know how many folks know this, but in the U.S. we largely allow our local governments to control our schooling. The federal government does little control. So in the U.S., every school board has different curriculum at some level. Some of it's mandated by the Fed, some of it locally. But point being, we found an interesting study that showed only about a fifth of high school students were completing civics courses for graduation. And the youth in America often gets kind of mocked for not participating in the traditional ways in a democracy. And what we kind of point out in the book is, well, nobody's really ever taught them how the democratic process works. I mean, they get the old sort of you have to vote line, but they don't really know why you vote or what you're voting for, or the purpose of activism and protests and organizing and things like that. And so we advocate for the inclusion of civics in education. That should be treated as important as anything else, especially if you live in a country that purports to be a democracy. It's incumbent upon every single citizen to be civically engaged, and thus it's incumbent upon the society to provide them with the skills, information, and perspectives necessary to be equal participants. Returning back to media, news media plays a major role in that. If you only have junk information in a democracy, you can expect junk outcomes. Voters need information. They need facts on the ground to help shape their vote. And so we advocate in the book for civics education, go back to the old school explanations. Why do we have democracy? What is the purpose of it? I often hit students with the Winston Churchill line that democracy is the worst system except for all the rest that have been tried from time to time. So that's kind of what we advocate for in the book, is centralizing civics education.
Okay. What about local media that try to tell the stories on a local level, and also how do you call it, community journalism or civic journalism? Is it something that is it a trend that is growing, or what do you see in the United States now?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah, we're the book. So far we've kind of gotten into some of the darker elements of what's wrong with the American media system. But there is a positive kind of spin on the story. There is a new birth of news media that's taking place, and as you point out rightly, it's happening a lot on the local level. And it's non-traditional. Some of these news outlets are like on YouTube, and they do like a series of vignettes every day. Some are podcasts that review the headlines and have on guests that are not appearing on traditional media. Some folks look like traditional newsrooms, but they focus on issues that are ignored by dominant press, like the Real News Network, for example, is in Baltimore, Maryland. They focus on local issues. And then you've got folks who are, like Abby Martin, who travels the world to look at American empire, so she can report back to American citizens what our empire is doing around the world. So yeah, I think it's kind of an exciting time. I teach journalism and I run a university paper, and I tell students, like, this is an exciting time to kind of transform what it means to be a journalist and how that serves our democracy. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot of exciting elements happening out there right now. And podcasting is one that I do personally, but I think podcasting is particularly interesting because for so long, broadcast news media told us that the average American, they can't focus on anything. That's why we do short segments. But you've got these podcasts that are like 3 to 4 hours, and people are tuning in by the millions. So there is a hunger for this type of investigative work and discussions. So I'm largely optimistic about where this kind of trend is heading.
Okay, that's great. Very interesting. Can you talk us something about Project Sensor, of which you are one of the contributors, if I don't...
Yeah. I've been contributing to Project Censored now for, I think, about 15 years, something like that. But Project Censored's been around since 1976, and it was founded on this idea that during the Watergate scandal in the United States, where it was shown that our president was bribing people and spying on people and destroying evidence and these things. The sort of main corporate press didn't start covering that story until years after it had started, but the local and independent press had already been covering it. And so Carl Jensen was a professor of sociology, and he kind of asked this question, like, well, if the independent press is covering stuff the corporate press was ignoring back then, what are we missing now? And he argued that these stories that do not make it in the corporate press are being censored. And so every year he'd have his students go out and find stories in the independent, smaller press and fact check them, see if they were covered by the corporate press. If they were not, they would be nominated for the top 25 censored stories. And it would go out as a list every year. And then eventually got made into a book. And so now it's an annual book every year of stories that are newsworthy stories that are ignored by the corporate press. He got some pushback where people in the corporate press said it's not that we don't want to cover those stories, it's that we can't. We have limited space in a newspaper, limited time on television. And he started doing an analysis every year, and I did this for about 6 or 7 years, which was called junk food news. which is, yeah, but the stuff you do cover is non-newsworthy. It's, you know, these sensationalistic celebrity stories. You're covering those instead of these stories my students are finding in the independent press. So, you know, I'm proud to say I've part of that long tradition of Project Censored with countless others, and my co-author Mickey Huff is the president of the foundation and director of Project Censored. But it continues to this very day. It's in universities across the world. Students are finding stories ignored by the corporate press. They're put in an annual book, and this annual censored book serves as a place where we can keep an almanac, a history of these media failures year after year, but also present media successes in the independent press.
That's great. Is it also online, probably on a website? Yeah.
Yeah, projectcensored.org. You can find that information.
Okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have some minutes for an open discussion and question from. There is a question from Tony. Do you have an opinion on the constructive news movement as they differ in the US and Europe?
Yeah. So as I kind of understand the movement, the constructive news movement is trying to basically create newsworthy news, right? Like it's trying to get away from we call in the book like the sensationalist content. So yeah, I'm a you know a supporter of this, kind of like I was mentioning earlier. I think a lot of this new media is participating in that. I can't really speak to how it's different between the U.S. and Europe. I'm just not an expert on that. But I think there's definitely a hunger out there for that type of journalism, and I think you see people like you know, Vice has to a degree kind of toyed with this here in the United States. I think you see a lot of people in the activist movements we have going on right now with Black Lives Matter, and in the environmental movement have tried to do this stuff as well. So I'm a big proponent of it. I think that, you know, one thing that kind of this recent spate of activism in the United States has shown us is that our obsession with fame and celebrities is really in itself a distraction and doesn't help us in terms of a crisis. So the celebrity voices, that's nice that they're finally speaking out on issues of race here in the United States, but that does nothing to really further the goals of those movements. Where I think a constructive news approach might give us more something to sink our teeth into as what we can do and kind of understand these problems.
Thank you. Other question? If you want, you can also unmute your microphone and comment or make your question to Nolan. We have still some minutes also. No question. So before closing, I'm taking some minutes because I want to thank you and thank Mikey if he couldn't come, and thank also Marco Dotti that was part of this webinar. We would like to propose the Global Critical Media Literacy Project here in Italy. In the next weeks, probably we will send out some materials to our colleagues around Italy and also to the students. I see a question coming. Tony, are you?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Nolan, for your presentation. I'd like to ask you this question. You talk about restructuring of communities, and you identify a major role in the reconstruction of communities to the media, whether they are mainstream or social, I suppose. The whole concept of social capital, as you know, originates in your country, although it doesn't develop in your company. It develops much more in in some parts of Europe, and unfortunately today, but Italy was one of the areas where social capital was not only studied, but also written about and delivered, etc. Now, we have the same problem that you seem to be having, although the causes are obviously different, and in your country, in trying to reconstruct some sort of social structure or social fiber in society. And we have the same problem here. We have destroyed our capital of social capital that we had accumulated in the last 50 years or 40 years. Where do you see this going in your country, and do you have anything to suggest that we should be doing over here?
Well, let me say, it'd be very American for me to tell other countries what to do, but no, I'm not going to make a suggestion on what you guys can do. I'm not informed enough on it, but I will comment on the U.S. case for sure. Yeah, I think America since the 1980s has gotten comfortable in this rejection of government, and kind of the underlying narrative there is it's a rejection of these relationships and institutions that make up the country. So one of the tough tasks that I think those of us who are advocating to strengthen democracy have is to make the case that these institutions may have run amok, but these institutions are necessary. And I'm talking about government, I'm talking about news media. We don't advocate for the abolition of these institutions. We think it's crucial to maintain them, but that's dependent upon the strong relationships between individuals and these institutions. And that's why we focus so much on partisanship in the book. We've lost that very basic social capital, that very basic connection between the people. And Mickey and I are right now working on a different text just about basic communication. I don't know how this is in Italy, but here in the United States, we've gotten way too comfortable just simply labeling people or canceling people or blocking people without making the effort to try and understand people or explain things to people. And so we're trying to bridge that gap, not necessarily because we think it's our job to explain everything to everybody, although as educators, it kind of is, but more so that it's necessary for democracy. We have to listen to each other. We have to understand each other. We have to explain our viewpoint to others, and we have to hear it. So I think it starts at the basic level with promoting things that academics, at least in the United States, generally try and avoid, with things like humility, humanity, empathy, sympathy. These kinds of notions I think are crucial if we want to rebuild that social capital, as at least I understand it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
If there are no other questions, I would like to thank you again. I want to show the book that I have bought in San Francisco at City Light Bookstore, and it was great, a great discovery. Thank you to everyone that has participated to this webinar, and see you for the next one in 2 or 3 weeks. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.